Greetings. We're studying 1 Corinthians. In our previous session, we looked at the reports or the rumors that came to Paul by way of Chloe's people, or the group that came with Stephanos. He was a visitor to wherever Paul was, and these two people brought, or groups of people perhaps, brought to Paul information about things going on back in the church in Corinth. He responded to these, as we studied last time: quarreling, party divisions, a case of sexual immorality, and then lawsuits that Christians were having with each other over pagan judges. Now we come in chapter 7 to the second major part of this letter, and this second major part is one that deals with the letter that they wrote to him, and he's answering the questions that they sent him. So we're in part 2 now, which is Paul's responding to a letter that they sent to him. Questions, of course, are in the letter that's missing. We don't have that letter anymore. But the answers are given in this section 7 to 16. So we'll begin with chapter 7 and see if we can figure out the question, the procedure that we have to go through, and then see what Paul does to answer this question. These are the two that we'll be dealing with in this session: man-woman problems. That's the general answer. We'll see the basis for that. And can a Christian eat food offered to idols? Now, it may seem at first as though those questions are, at least the second one, are no longer relevant to us. But we'll discover in the process of looking at the text that not only are there man-woman problems now, as then, but also the question about eating food offered to idols raises a lot of interesting ethical questions that are still with us. So let's turn to chapter 7 and look at the way it begins. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote. Now that's the only evidence we have that they wrote to him, but he says so very plainly here. He uses this formula. This is a literary formula, now concerning. Usually, when a new question starts, he uses that same formula to introduce his answer, now concerning the next question, whatever it is. So we don't have the questions, but we can answer, we can in a sense figure out the question from the answer. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. What was the question? Well, the question had something to do with man-woman relationships. And so we follow through on this in the rest of the chapter, and we'll see that every aspect of man-woman relationships is brought out in the open. Single people, married people, divorce, this kind of thing is the topic of chapter 7, and must have been implicit, at least, in the question that they sent to him in their letter. Now he states a general principle first, and this general principle is one of the best insights we have into Paul's understanding of the status of women. Look carefully now at how he begins this argument. Because of the temptation to immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. Now the assumption that lies behind that is one of one man, one woman married together, not polygamy, monogamy. Polygamy was the custom in Semitic countries, and still is in some respects in Semitic culture. The Jews of Jesus' time practiced polygamy. If they could afford more than one wife, they could have more than one wife. The Jews and the Romans did not. The Jews and the Romans were monogamous cultures. Corinth is a Gentile city, Roman colony, and therefore the customs there are not polygamy, as they are in Semitic lands, but rather monogamy. One person, one woman, one man. So that's what he's talking about here now. That's what lies behind each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. Notice now, the husband is first mentioned. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. The rights of the woman are mentioned first, not second. The rights of the wife, the husband must, in some sense, observe and take care of. And likewise, the second half of the coin, the wife, because he says, for the wife does not rule over her own body. This is the reason lying behind the husband's need to be considerate of the wife's conjugal rights. says the husband does not rule over his own body, but the wife does, and vice versa. The wife does not rule over her own body, but the husband does. It's an interesting way in which he repeats the ideas and reverses the order. Likewise, he says the husband doesn't rule over his own body, but the wife does. So you see an interesting statement here in which the wife comes first in the second time around, the husband came first in the first time around. But the responsibilities are exactly equal. One does not dominate the other one in Paul's understanding, but they work in some kind of equal cooperative relationship. Do not refuse one another, except perhaps by agreement for a season, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, lest Satan tempt you through lack of self-control. Now the principle there is another one that we're not familiar with in modern times. The principle is that in some ways the ancient world believed that sexual activity and religious activity didn't go together. Now in some other parts of the ancient world that wasn't true. Sexual activity and religious worship did go together. But the Jewish people, and Paul here represents a strictly Jewish idea, the Jewish people believed that sexual activity rendered you unclean for worship. And therefore, if you really wish to devote yourself to prayer, have a spiritual experience together, then you cut out the physical altogether. And that's what he's saying here about devoting yourself to prayer for a time. But then, after the time is over, come together again so that you won't be tempted. Notice how prominent temptation features in Paul's rationale here. Now he says in verse 6, I say this by way of concession, not of command. That means that's second best, not first best. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own special gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. Now here's a basic answer to the question they must have raised with him. And his answer is, every man should have a woman and every woman should have a man, and they should satisfy each other. They should be careful to look after each other's interests. But he says, that's really not the ideal. That's just the concession. That's the second best plan. The first best plan is not to have sexual activities at all, to be single as he was, to be celibate, to have such control over your sexual appetites that you don't need to express it at all. So the real Paul comes through here as one who defends celibacy and singleness as a superior state. But he doesn't condemn marriage. Marriage is okay as a concession to our weaknesses and our temptations. So he goes on with his advice in verse 8, to the unmarried and the widows, I say it is well for them to remain single as I do. It's an interesting verse because some people have taken out of this verse the idea that Paul was already at some point in his life married and is now a widower. As a widower, he's remaining a widower, single. But that's a very slight suggestion, and it's very difficult to know whether Paul was ever married or not. As far as we know from all the information we have, Paul is not a widower. He was a single person dedicated to celibacy all of his life. But we don't know that for sure. That's just the best we can guess. But he says if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it's better to marry, and then the text says, than to burn. It's better to marry than to burn. That's all the Greek text says. It doesn't say to be aflame with passion. That's the translator's interpretation of the Greek text, which means to burn. Other translations decide that that means burn in hell or suffer eternal punishment. But the text doesn't say that either. All the text says it's better to marry than to burn. And you have to figure out yourself exactly what that means. Now he turns to the married. To the married I give charge, not I, but the Lord. Now here's a very important distinction. Paul is here now separating his own opinions from those from a command of the Lord. In Paul's letters, every time he uses the phrase the Lord, he's not referring to the historical Jesus, the Jesus who lived and walked and taught in the days of his flesh. Paul is referring to the risen Lord. The risen Lord is the phrase that Paul uses, actually, the Lord Jesus Christ risen from the dead. This Lord, Paul was in communication with this Lord. That is, he believed that much of his gospel was given to him by revelation from the risen Lord. So he has a command of the risen Lord here, he says. It's not his own opinion. It's something that he has as a command from the Lord. To the married I give charge, not I, this is not my opinion, but it's a command of the Lord that the wife should not separate from her husband. Now if we skip the parenthesis for the moment, and that the husband should not divorce his wife. These are different verbs, divorce here and separate. And that causes all kinds of difficulties in later history, explaining the difference between separation on the one hand and divorce on the other hand. I have a feeling at this point, but there's no way to prove it, that Paul here is using these words interchangeably. He's not making a distinction between separation and divorce. He's talking about the same thing, divorce. I think that's the case, but there's no way to settle that for sure. The parenthesis says, if she does, let her remain single. That strengthens to me the idea of a divorce. If she separates but doesn't divorce, she's no longer single. She's still married but separated. But the parenthesis indicates that she's now single after her separation, and that to me suggests divorce. Or else be reconciled to her husband. That is, remarriage is not allowed here. You can't, after divorce, marry somebody else, according to this tradition, which Paul reports as the command of the Lord. Now this has a reflection in the Gospel of Mark and the teachings of Jesus too, where divorce and remarriage is forbidden. And these two texts, one from Mark, also one from Matthew in a parallel, and a place in Luke, is one that has been variously interpreted and caused all kinds of interpretative problems in the history of the church since then. We're now simply looking at how Paul handles this problem in Corinth in his own time. He turns now from the married to the rest. It's kind of peculiar because who are the rest? He's already dealt with the single people and now the married people, and now he talks with the rest. But let's see if we can see what this might be saying. To the rest I say, not the Lord. Now he's making a distinction. He's saying this is not a saying of the Lord, a command of the Lord. This is my opinion. I say, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who's an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. See that situation? If any brother, that's a Christian, has a wife who is not a Christian, and she consents to live with him, then he should not divorce her. You don't divorce on the grounds of not being a believer. If any woman has a husband who's an unbeliever, and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. Now, a woman divorcing her husband was not possible in Palestine, in Jewish cultures, but it is in Roman and Greek cultures. So we know here that Paul is dealing with the customs in Corinth where women can divorce their husbands. Then there's a puzzle. We don't know how to figure this out. The unbelieving husband is consecrated through his wife. This doesn't say the unbelieving husband might be consecrated through his wife. It says the unbelieving husband is consecrated through his wife. And the unbelieving wife is consecrated through her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean. But as it is, they are holy. They are holy even though one partner is not a believer, because the believing partner consecrates the other one. That's what Paul seems to be saying. But if the unbelieving partner, on the other hand, desires to separate, let it be so. In such case, the brother or the sister is not bound, for God has called us to peace. Wife, how do you know whether you will save your husband? Husband, how do you know whether you will save your wife? If you emphasize these last two questions, then you can understand the whole text in a different way. I'm not sure this is right, but if you do take your starting point from the way it ends, then you can say the whole principle of staying together when one does not believe and the other one does lies in the possibility or the hope that the unbelieving one will be converted finally or be persuaded finally by the believing one. It opens the door toward a possible new believing person. And that may be the case. That may be what Paul meant. But that leaves unanswered those troubling questions about the wife consecrating the husband and the husband consecrating the wife in order that the children may be made holy. Now, he has another comment here in verse 25 about the unmarried. He's already talked about single people. This is single people again. But we have a lot of information in this paragraph here, helps us to understand both Paul and the circumstances in Corinth. He says, concerning the unmarried, I have no command of the Lord, but I give my opinion as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. There we have again, for the third time, a distinction between a command of the Lord and the opinions of Paul. Now we regard the opinions of Paul as Scripture, and therefore, in a sense, as commands of the Holy Spirit. And that's something which we have to consider and talk about more. Paul didn't do that. He considered that his own opinion was on a lower level than the command of the Lord. But he gives his own opinion here as one who thinks he's trustworthy, and he recommends himself here, so to speak, as a trustworthy advisor. He says, I think that in view of the present distress, it is well for a person to remain as he is. And when he says the present distress, he means the imminence or the soonness of the coming of the new age. This is the last generation. The world will pass away. All the way through Paul's letters, we see signs that Paul believed he was living in the last days. The present distress are the tribulations that precede the end, before the end finally comes. So he says, in view of the impending distress, the present distress, then it's better to, the status quo is the best thing. Stay the way you are, whatever it is. Are you bound to a wife? Don't seek to be free. Are you free from a wife? Don't seek marriage. If you do marry, you do not sin. And if a girl marries, she does not sin. Yet those who marry will have worldly troubles, and I would spare you that. Worldly troubles. He expands that a little later on. He says in general, if you're unmarried, you're free to devote your entire time to the service of the Lord. But if you're married, you have to please your spouse. Do this, that, and the other. He says, I'd spare you all that difficulty. Actually, as we all know, the single persons are not so unilaterally devoted to the service of the Lord. They are often troubled by being single, and therefore they settle into a better pattern of serving the Lord after they're married. But those are modern issues and modern reflections. We'll pick up what Paul is saying now. I mean, brethren, the appointed time has grown very short. That's the time for the end of the age. From now on, let those who have wives live as though they had none, and those who mourn as though they were not mourning, and those who rejoice as though they were not rejoicing, and those who buy as though they had no goods, and those who deal with the world as though they had no dealings with the world. For the form of this world is passing away. That's the end. That's when this generation will pass away and the new age will come. Now this is what modern ethicists call an interim ethic. An interim ethic is the way you behave for a short period of time before something else happens. Interim ethics are not the same as absolute ethics. Absolute ethics are ethics that are valid and true all the time, under all circumstances. But interim ethics is a special way of behaving in a short period of time. If you knew, for example, that you were going to die in 3 days, would you behave exactly the same way in those last 3 days as if you thought you had another 20 years? If you would behave exactly the same way, then you're living strictly by absolutes. But if you would do some things that you wouldn't ordinarily do, then you'd be doing things under an interim ethic plan. And that's the kind of question that Paul raises here. He's giving us instructions which are interim ethics, the ethics for the time period between now and the end. If one doesn't believe that the end is just around the corner, and if the centuries keep rolling on, well, then we have to reconsider these interim ethics instructions of Paul in this part of the letter. Now the second question that's raised, the second question that Paul has to deal with is one that at first at least seems to us no longer relevant. Can a person eat food offered to idols? He begins this discussion in the same formula way that he did the other one, now concerning food offered to idols. they ask a question. He's now turning to the new question, the second question, with the same kind of formula that he used introducing the first one. Now, when he answers this question, can we eat food offered to idols? He seems to be quoting from a letter that they wrote to him. When the translators in this RSV put some of this in quotation marks, they're doing that because they believe that they're quoting from the lost letter that was sent to Paul. In that lost letter, certain persons were claiming that they possessed knowledge, and this knowledge gave them privileges that they were testing out with Paul. So he says, you're right, we know that all of us possess knowledge. Knowledge, he says, though puffs up, but love builds up. If anyone imagines that he knows something, he doesn't yet know as he ought to know. But if one loves God, one is known by him. That's a basic principle. That principle is saying, if you really know the truth, or if you think you know the truth, you may be wrong. It's better to be cautious and deal with probabilities than it is to be arrogant and claim to know the truth. So he says we all have freedom, we all have knowledge, but knowledge tends to make you proud, puffed up, hard to work with, not cooperative with others who have a different point of view. And so he begins by cautioning those people who have this kind of knowledge, which gives them liberty to do anything. He cautions them that they better be careful and make sure love is always present. So he gives this kind of answer. As to the eating of food offered to idols, we know an idol has no real existence. They did too, that there is no God but one. For though there may be so-called gods in heaven or on earth, as there indeed are many gods, so-called gods, and many lords, so-called lords, yet for us, Christians, there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, from whom we exist, for whom we exist, and one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things and through whom we exist. So he's conceding to their argument completely. He says, you're right, there's only one God. Idols are nothing. We really know that. I know that as well as you do, he's saying. But then he has a cautionary thing. He says, as a good caution, not every Christian is that far along. Not all the members of the church think this way. Not all possess this knowledge. Some, meaning some Christians, some members of the church, through being hitherto accustomed to idols, they eat food as really offered to an idol, to a something, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. Food will not commend us to God. We're no worse off if we don't eat, no better off if we do. Only take care lest this liberty of yours somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. Now there's his caution. This is where he puts a little catch in it, so to speak. Sure, you're free to eat anything you please. You Corinthians who have this boast about knowledge, about knowing so much, he says you're free to do as you please. But just remember, there are other church members who aren't that far along. They haven't reached the stage of faith that you're in, and they might be misled by your actions to do things that they believe are wrong. Your conscience is clear, but you may cause them to do something which violates their conscience. And that, he says, is not good. That's not acting in love. So he continues on to say, if you're one of these weak Christians, might not you be tempted or encouraged to eat food offered to an idol? And so, by your knowledge, this weak man is destroyed, the brother for whom Christ died. That is, he's destroyed by violating his conscience. Thus, sinning against your brethren and wounding their conscience when it's weak, you sin against Christ. And here's his concluding principle. If food is a cause of my brother's falling, I will never eat meat, lest I cause my brother to fall. That has nothing to do with vegetarianism. This has only to do with the freedom of the Christian person to eat meat offered to an idol. But he's saying, if you have a weaker Christian friend who thinks it's really wrong to do this, well then give it up. It's not that important. Food's not going to get you into the kingdom. So be careful to observe the courtesy, that'd be the weakest level, to respect other people's conscience as well as your own. Now that same point of view is repeated in chapter 10. He says in chapter 10, repeating them again, all things are lawful. That's one of their quotes. But not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up. There again, he's coming to the same principle that he stated back in chapter 8. Sure, it's legal. Everything is open. You could eat anything you please, but some things are not helpful. Don't seek your own good, but the good of the neighbor. It's a famous verse because in King James, this was put not in terms of one's own good, but was put with the old Elizabethan word wealth. Let no one seek his own wealth, but the wealth of his neighbor. That's what the King James read. And that's interesting. The older King James, they changed it in later editions. But this doesn't mean wealth in terms of money. This means welfare, the well-being, the good of your neighbor. So you're free to eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question of conscience, for the earth is the Lord's and everything in it. If one of the unbelievers invites you to go to dinner at a pagan temple, and you're supposed to go, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. But if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then out of consideration for the man who informed you, and for conscience sake, I mean his conscience, not yours, don't eat it. So there you have the principle reinforced. Now right exactly after that, our troubles begin, because we have a little section which sounds different. It comes to a different conclusion. If we wish to summarize the answer Paul gives so far, the answer is yes, you're free to offer to eat anything you please, but consider the conscience of your weaker brethren. So the answer is yes, but. And now we come to a little short, angry phrase which doesn't have yes, but as the answer, but just has a plain oh yes. Here's the way this is phrased. Why should my liberty be determined by another person's scruples? Change the wording on this. Why should my liberty be curtailed by somebody else's conscience? If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks? That's a protest. That's a protest that doesn't fit what we just read. This is something different, and it's a puzzle. Now, if you go back before this, you find another part of this puzzle. There's a section here that has a different answer to the question. We found two answers so far, yes, but, and yes, without any but. Now we have a different answer. Therefore, my beloved, shun the worship of idols. I speak as to sensible men. Judge for yourselves what I say. The cup of blessing which we bless, is it not a participation in the blood of Christ? The bread which we break, is it not a participation in the body of Christ? Those are rhetorical questions, and the answer is yes, of course. Because there is one bread, we who are many are one body. For we all partake of the one bread. Consider the practice of the people of Israel. Are not those who eat the sacrifices partners in the altar? What do I imply then? That food offered to idols is anything? Or that an idol is anything? No, he says, I imply that what these are eating is, what they're thinking about when they think of idols is a demonic power of some kind. That's what he then says. I imply that what pagan sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. Now what is an idol? An idol is a demon. An idol is not nothing anymore. An idol is a something, and it's a bad something, a demon. I do not want you to be partners with demons. You cannot drink the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You cannot partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. Shall we provoke the Lord to jealousy? Are we stronger than he? This is a very different answer yet. Now the answer is no. Under no circumstances can you eat food offered to an idol. Why? Not because it offends the conscience of a weaker brother or sister. No, because it makes you partner with the demon that food was offered to. And if you're really one with the Lord, you cannot be a partner with a demon. So now we have three answers given to this question. The first one is the basic one and the real Pauline answer. We know that because it appears twice instead of once, and because it also appears in Romans 14 in the same way. But then we have an angry protest on both sides. A more conservative protest that says, no, you can't do this, and a more liberal protest which says, yes, you can. How do we explain that? We don't know for sure, but we do know that the letters of Paul, as we now have them, are not preserved exactly as he wrote them. The letters of Paul that we now have have been copied for a couple of hundred years before the earliest copies that we now have can be seen. And in that copying process, there were some additions made to the text. It's a very complex problem. We'll have to look at it in several other ways, but it's very possible that this manuscript, which expressed Paul's point of view as a yes but answer to the question, has been expanded in the copying process by more conservative people who said no is the right answer, and by more liberal scribes who said yes without any but is the right answer. That's something that we can take as a possible solution to the way in which this conflicting set of answers appears in this letter. Now, this is more relevant to us than we might think, because it raises certain questions like this. Are the absolutes that Paul gives us in 1 Corinthians 7 about marriage and divorce, are they really absolutes? Or when the times change, do we have to reconsider those? Would God give us the same kinds of rules in a different circumstance than He gave us then? That's one kind of question. Are Paul's rules absolutes, or are they interim ethics? And then when we come to the matter of food offered to idols, we have to raise this question. Is conscience a safe guide? Can we go by conscience in deciding ethical matters? Is conscience that reliable, or is conscience sometimes your own group? They're very relevant. They may lead you to a better understanding of the problems that we face in our time now. Next time, we'll pursue these questions and answers and come to two more questions and Paul's answers to those. So I'll see you all then.